Welcome to this edition of Pre-Internet Plane Spotting, brought to you by JetFlix. Hi there, my name is Henry Tenby. I'd like to welcome you to this edition of Pre-Internet Plane Spotting, and I have the pleasure to take you back to my hometown airport, back actually almost 100 years to the 1930s, up to about the 1950s and 1960s. We're going to be featuring a very special episode on what YVR was like in relation to air shows. Now, many of you know that the Abbotsford Airshow has been going for many decades. They started the Abbotsford Airshow in the early 1960s. But did you know that before they started the Abbotsford Airshow, they actually used to have public displays, air shows, open houses at YVR, Vancouver International Airport? That is true. There are very few photos that exist and very few historical reference points in archives on the details of these open houses and these air shows that were held at Vancouver back in the from the 1930s, certainly through to the 1950s. And images are very hard to find, but these events did happen, and I have been able to get some images, which I'm going to share, along with some very interesting stories as well. As an aviation fan, my father started taking me to the Abbotsford Air Show in the late 1960s. And by the mid-1970s, I was absolutely obsessed with aviation. And I do have some photos taken by myself that I took with a small Instamatic black and white camera at the Abbotsford Air Show. I believe the first year I took images was 1974. And I took a good friend of mine from the day, a neighborhood friend of mine who was also mad about aviation. His name was Graham Ramage. And my dad took us to the Abbotsford Air Show, and I had just returned back from a family holiday to New York, and it was great. I remember seeing the Starfighters and Voodoos, Arguses, etc. And my dad, he was a practicing doctor. By 1980, I had still not evolved to the high quality photography of 35 millimeter Kodachrome slides, and I was still using a pretty cheap camera. And the images I was taking at the time were not very high quality, unfortunately, but they're great memories for me. Of course, the Vickers Vulcan was always a crowd pleaser and an aircraft that I found to be a terrific performer. I loved the sound, the thunder of the engines. And by 1980, I was, of course, mad in love with the Vickers Vulcan. And also in 1980, it was an important year because the the Canadian Armed Forces, and prior to that, the RCAF, had been operating since the mid-1950s the Canadair Argus as an anti-submarine patrol aircraft. And in 1980-81, the Argus fleet was retired and replaced by the then new CP-140, or what the Americans call the P-3 Orion. We called it the Aurora. And the aircraft was shown to the public for the first time at the 1980 Abbotsford Air Show, and I did get some photos of the aircraft during that display, which are kind of neat, and I'm happy to have them. As this video is concentrating on the era between the 1930s and the 1950s, at YVR, of course, the most popular airplane during this time frame, in a commercial sense, can you guess what type it would have been? Well, if you guessed the DC-3, you would be correct. The reason being is that the operators here in Vancouver, as well as our national carriers, Canadian Pacific and Trans-Canada Airlines, operated Douglas DC-3s in quite large numbers. Locally based, we had two airlines here in Vancouver operating DC-3s in good numbers back in the 1950s, and that included Pacific Western Airlines and Canadian Pacific. And there was also QCA, Queen Charlotte Airlines, as well. So that actually makes three locally based airlines that were major operators of the Douglas DC-3 in the 1950s. Through World War II and up until the late 1950s or early 1960s, the RCAF actually maintained an Air Force base of sorts at YVR.
Standby alert, standby alert, standby alert.
at the AMU, and the Canadian Air Force at the time, based here in Vancouver, had a fleet, a small fleet, of H-21 Piasecki Flying Banana helicopters. And PBY Canso rescue aircraft as well. And these aircraft would be dispatched when typically a ship would get into distress north or in the inlet waterways in the vicinity of Vancouver, Victoria, and up the coast. And these aircraft would be dispatched to bring people back to Vancouver on rescue missions. And by the early 1960s, this search and rescue capability was transferred over to Comox, and the PBY Cansos and Piasekis were retired through the mid-1960s, I would say. It was great because here at Vancouver, there were often public displays of aircraft that would involve the public, be it the Vickers Vulcan. When it came to visit Vancouver, I believe in the late 1950s, it drew terrific crowds, as you can see from the images that I'm sharing here. The Vulcan I believe there were two Vulcans that attended Vancouver during this visit, and they ferried across the Atlantic and then across Canada. And I believe they even went down to Las Vegas and came up through the United States when they arrived in Vancouver in, I believe it was around 1959. Let's start with our oldest images. This would be approximately 1936-1937 on the occasion of the opening of the then new airport terminal building. Now, YVR, or Vancouver Airport, actually officially opened in 1931, although an airfield existed here as far back as probably the 19-teens or the 20s. The Douglas DC-3 was introduced to service for the first time in 1936. We can date this image to approximately that date when United Airlines, as shown here, brought their brand new Douglas DC-3 to Vancouver for the occasioning of the new airport facilities, which included a hard stand, as the aircraft is seen parked on a hard stand, and we can see that the public was allowed in to inspect the brand new aircraft. Notice in the background the old, well, we know it as the old Air BC, old Air West hangar today, and it was one of the first hangar facilities at YVR, and you can see the river and Richmond in the far distance as well in the upper left-hand frame of the image. The aircraft is registered NC 18943, mainliner, Douglas DC-3. It most likely came up the west coast, possibly via Bellingham, certainly via Seattle and Portland, and other points further south. Notice the massive crowd of people on the old 1930 styles car. This drew a terrific crowd. Back then, aviation was basically the internet of the day. Many young men were air-minded, and anything to do with aviation would draw a terrific crowd and much public interest and media interest. As shown in this picture, there was also a Trans-Canada Airlines Lockheed Lodestar present in this open day proceedings, with the public inspecting that aircraft as well. In the background is the hangar which some of us know as the McMillan-Bloedel hangar. In the 1950s and 1960s, McMillan-Bloedel used this hangar as a storage and maintenance facility for their Grumman Goose and aircraft operations base. Of course, this hangar still exists to this very day, and if you drive out to the South Terminal, it's situated about 100 or 150 meters due east of the parking lot that faces the main ramp and the runways. Those of us that are old enough to remember, 1977 was the year that Air Canada celebrated its 40th anniversary, which means Air Canada, then TCA or Trans-Canada Airlines, was actually incorporated in 1937 as a Crown corporation. Some of their first aircraft, of course, were Lockheed Lodestars, like the example shown here on the main apron at YVR. Now, this image would date probably from around 1937, possibly the same time as the open day photos that were just shown of the United Airlines DC-3. Between 1945 and 1961, Trans-Canada Airlines operated a fleet of 30 Douglas DC-3 aircraft on local service routes all across Canada. So we know that this image, at the very oldest, is from 1945. So the aircraft were acquired at the close of World War II. Now, the DC-3, although it was a commonplace aircraft, it too drew a crowd wherever it went because of so many air-minded people of the day. An airplane was quite rare. Many people at the time, of course, were taking trains to cross the country, as that was the affordable means of transport. Aviation and flying was something for the very wealthy, and very few people had actually ever been on an airplane in 1945. This YVR image dates from probably post-war 1940s. Notice that the people are watching the aircraft being loaded for its next flight. At the time, TCA operated the DC-3s pretty much everywhere from Vancouver, across to the island, down to Seattle, across the Rockies to Alberta and the prairies, and even north. So the DC-3 truly was a local workhorse for our national carrier. I'm also a collector of 35mm color slides of aircraft. If you have an aircraft slide collection that you'd like to dispose of or sell or get rid of, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to contact me at my email address, which is shown on the screen. That's henrytenby@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you about your slide collection. Note the RCAF hangar facilities in the upper right-hand corner of the photograph. These hangar facilities were constructed during the war years and remained in place at YVR, known as the AMU, up until about 20 years ago. And Canadian Armed Forces would station aircraft through this facility, including 707s, Cosmopolitans, Hercules, Starfighters, you name it, they would park here right through the 1970s and 1980s until the hangar was eventually demolished. In 1958, Pan Am and the Boeing Company brought the first Boeing 707 to Vancouver. It's shown on the left-hand side of this image, taken in 1958. This was a very special occasion. The 707, of course, was a world beater, and at the time, everybody that did travel flew on prop-driven aircraft, like the Qantas Super Connie on the right-hand side of the frame. Actually, a correction is required because the British built de Havilland Comet had been in service already for a few years in the form of the Comet 2, 3, and 4. Although here in Vancouver, of course, a Comet had not yet appeared in the form of a commercial airliner, as the Royal Canadian Air Force operated Comets, but they were for military use only. So a passenger-carrying jetliner was something very special. The 707 shown on the left-hand side of the frame is carrying Pan Am titles, but it's actually a Boeing demonstrator aircraft in the Boeing scheme. Notice that the observation deck is completely packed with people, and there are also quite a few people on the apron. So this was a huge event. The media came out, the public came out, everybody wanted to see the new jetliner, and it was a huge, huge, huge media event for the day to see a jetliner. It's believed that this photograph was taken on Sunday, June the 15th, 1958, to mark the occasion of Vancouver's Sea Island Airport Airshow. The date was Sunday, June the 15th, 1958, and history was made for more than a few reasons. It was on this date that the Vancouver International Airport opened up for an open day, an air show with flying aircraft that took place right on the active airfield. Hundreds, if not thousands of people showed up for this amazing event, as shown in these incredible images that I'm about to share with you. The exact details of these events and whether there was more than one and how many were there have been lost to the memory of history, unfortunately. We do have this date because of a newspaper article that supported the information that is about to be shared. But other dates are unknown, but we do believe these air shows did take place on more than just the one occasion in June of 1958. As this photograph shows, they actually fenced off quite a large portion of the operating main ramp space to accommodate the crowds for the air show. Looks like they just used a small rope to keep people sectioned in one area. The Sea Island Airport Air Show, as it was called, was actually part of the province of BC's 100th anniversary celebrations. The province was incorporated in 1858, and in a race for leadership in the passenger jetliner market, a race was heating up between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that presented itself right here in Vancouver, as I'm about to explain. On this special day, they kept the airport and aircraft operations going from the Pacific Western Airlines and Canadian Pacific terminal area, as shown here. The Cold War realities actually brought the Americans and the Russians face to face right here at the Vancouver International Airport for the air show, with the Boeing 707 facing off against the Russians' Tupolev Tu-104 jetliner. Both jetliners actually performed demonstration flights that day, and the story of the friction between the two competing aircraft builders was relayed to the public through newspaper stories of the day. The headline in the Prince George Citizen newspaper that followed the event was, as quote, "Incident at Vancouver International Air Show. Russian pilot gives and gets an emphatic niet." The east-west curtain was parted for the day in Vancouver in what might have been an international aeronautical incident that was actually averted. A giant Russian jetliner, the Tupolev Tu-104, was on public view at the air show that day. RCAF officials actually estimated that 100,000 people attended the air show, and it was part of a 2-day centennial event to mark the 100th birthday of the province of British Columbia. It was reported that Russian-American relations became strained at one point during the air show. Captain Frolov, the Tu-104 captain, had been granted permission to make a courtesy flight and visit Victoria Airport from Vancouver, a mere 75 miles as the jet flies. But the Tupolev's flight had to be canceled. The flight path of the aircraft would have brought the jetliner close to the international border where San Juan Island, which is an American territory, juts into Canadian territorial waters in the Georgia Strait. Captain Frolov, fearing slight drift might accidentally cause him to cross the U.S. boundary, asked that assurances would be given so that his aircraft would not be challenged by U.S. fighter jets. RCAF officials were told by the Americans that no such assurances would be forthcoming from the U.S. Air Force. The Russian pilot was told, quote, "Nobody will say they, the Americans, won't scramble, even if just to take a look at you." End quote. Therefore, diplomatically, the Tupolev flight to Victoria had to be canceled, and instead, a courtesy flight over the Greater Vancouver area was planned with government officials, aviation representatives from both Canada and the U.S., as well as newspapermen being invited aboard the aircraft for the flight. Earlier in the day, the Tupolev captain Frolov and his officers were taken on a demonstration flight aboard the Boeing 707 as guests of Tex Johnson, chief of flight testing for the Boeing Aircraft Company. Once the Boeing 707 was aloft, Tex Johnston invited Captain Frolov to sit in the pilot's seat and handle the control of the 707 for most of the hour-long flight. Captain Frolov said the Boeing 707 had beautiful flight control, and he seemed impressed with Boeing's new jetliner. Later the same day, a reciprocal invitation was extended by the Russians to the Boeing 707 crew and Tex Johnston to join the Tupolev for their demonstration flight. Johnson asked if the favor could be returned so he could handle the controls of the Tupolev Tu-104, and Frolov said, quote, "Niet," end quote, which means no. Johnson then asked if he could sit in the co-pilot seat, and he was again refused, and Captain Frolov explained that the Tupolev required 2 trained pilots to fly the aircraft, so therefore the co-pilot seat wasn't available. At that point, Johnson retired from the discussion, but after the flight, he did say that the Tupolev appeared to heavy handle and was slow to respond. Tex Johnston was quoted in the media as saying, "For my money, their plane is obsolete." When the Tupolev was back on the ramp at YVR after the demo flight and the deplaning stairway was in place and the engines were winding down, Tex Johnston turned to the Russian navigator and said, quote, "I have a message for the captain. Please tell him that in my 21,000 hours of piloting time, the Tupolev 104 is the sorriest damn airplane I have ever had the misfortune of flying in," end quote. As airline history would unfold in the decades after this amazing event, the Boeing 707 family of jetliners would become the staple of international jet travel. And they were only replaced when more fuel-efficient wide-body jetliners were delivered to the world's airlines in the 1970s. And what of the Tupolev 104? It, unfortunately, was not a commercial success, with only 201 airframes being built by the time production ended in 1960. The aircraft was only operated by Aeroflot and the Czech airline CSA. By comparison, 1,010 Boeing 707s were built by Boeing by the time production ended in the early 1980s. This very interesting facet of the history of the jet race, coupled with Cold War tensions, took place right here in Vancouver on the apron at what's present day the South Terminal some half a century ago, and now you know the story. In 1959, Qantas Airlines replaced their Connies into Vancouver with the then brand new Boeing 707, and it drew a terrific crowd as well when it made its first appearance at YVR. The aircraft is seen here on the present-day South Terminal Customs ramp and is being inspected by the public and the media. The Qantas skid between Vancouver and Australia was continuously operated by the Boeing 707s until Qantas took delivery of Boeing 747 aircraft in the early 1970s. Smoke on is not only a snowbird's command, it's also an observation from the 1950s. Here we have the 1959 inaugural departure from Vancouver back to Sydney of the Qantas 707. The smoke pouring out of these engines was pretty typical. These were the original, earliest versions of the 707 engines, and they were water injected for additional thrust. Hence, they belched out black smoke in huge quantities, which made for an impressive takeoff. Roughly 1 decade later, in 1968, Vancouver opened the new airport facility just about 500 meters to the north of the South Terminal. The new airport facility featured, of course, air bridges and closed gate areas and a closed walking and gate area system connecting the passenger check-in and baggage areas to the passenger planing and deplaning areas. Notice the open observation deck in the central upper frame. It was situated just below the control tower and provided a fabulous view of the apron between the two fingers facing west. The observation deck would be the pretty much only place for the public to view aircraft, and of course, with the opening of the new airport, air shows and aircraft displays would definitely be a thing of the past and never to be repeated again at YVR in the same capacity as we experienced here at this airport in the 1950s and earlier years. If you like this video, please click the thumbs up below. That would be awesome. Thank you very much. Also, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. I'd love to see that. I'd like to introduce myself. Hi there, my name is Henry Tenby. I am the creator of JetFlix TV, which is the new aviation superfan streaming service. If you'd like to try JetFlix TV, I have a couple of suggestions for you. In the upper right-hand corner is a pop-out where you can click and you can get the first 30 days free, full access to JetFlix TV, and then it's only $5.99 a month, and I hope that you'll check it out. There's another option as well that's now in the pop-out in the upper right-hand corner where you can save money by subscribing for 6 months or 1 year. So it might be something you might like to check out. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you on the next show.